Over the course of this series, I've covered some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities across the world. I started off with the Middle East, home to nearly all of the oldest continuously inhabited cities, some dating back well over 5,000 years. Then I covered European cities, many dating back to classical antiquity. I also covered the Americas and Africa, where only a small handful date back to before the Common Era, while the overwhelming majority were founded during modern times. In this video, I'm going to cover Australia, and then in my next video, New Zealand. In sharp contrast to nearly all other places around the world, Australia did not have any cities before the arrival of the British. Most Aboriginals lived in stateless societies, oftentimes in small villages. They had to move from spot to spot, hunting after game, clashing with other tribes, etc. For this reason, all of the cities I've mentioned are younger than the United States' Declaration of Independence. For this reason, we have exact dates rather than ranges. And on top of that, you don't see too many cool legendary stories clouded in mystery and exaggeration, but rather pretty reliable first-hand accounts of what early settlement days were like. So let's start off with the first and most famous one, Sydney. Sydney started off in 1788. The physical land that Sydney sits on obviously had native Aboriginal people, hunting, fishing, and gathering. However, their technology was fairly primitive, primarily composed of wood, bones, shells, and stone. These people did not build cities, nor did they use metal like copper or iron. The primary reason for this lack of innovation was due to geography, as the Australian continent/island is extremely isolated. This meant that the Aboriginals arriving on the island had almost no contact with the outside world. We have a few pieces of evidence that sailors from Southeast Asia may have made contact with northern Australia for trading purposes, and we even found a coin that probably came from some medieval Islamic African city-state dating back to the 1400s. The dingo, the largest carnivore on the continent, is not native to the continent and was probably brought by outsiders. But outside of these little tidbits, there really barely was any contact. For this reason, there was a lack of goods, services, people, and ideas being exchanged between Australia and the outside world, which meant that the Aboriginals had stagnated technologically. On top of that, there weren't any major flora or fauna that could be domesticated natively that could produce enough calories to sustain a settlement population, which would then lead to the diversification of labor, and without the diversification of labor, you don't really get a civilization, let alone large cities. Captain Cook first arrived around Botany Bay in 1770. The initial interaction with the Aboriginals was violent, and Cook failed to establish any formal relations with them, but nonetheless, in 1788, a permanent settlement of Botany Bay would come to fruition. This is where the notorious story of the convicts began. Britain had already been using the American colonies for their convicts. However, the American War of Independence was creating issues with this dynamic, and they were seeking somewhere else to hold a penal colony, and this seemed to be the perfect place. Keep in mind that many of these convicts were not hardened criminals, many of them were just debt prisoners, and a disproportionate number of the convicts that would later arrive were Irish Catholics facing discrimination back home. And so the colony of New South Wales was founded. This is the colony or state that Sydney resides in, under Governor Arthur Phillip. The initial settlement struggled as the soil proved to be pretty crappy for crops. Another issue was the indigenous population, who had been wiped out by smallpox and other diseases, given the fact that smallpox is a zoonotic disease, meaning that it comes from animals, in this case, cattle. Since the indigenous people did not have domesticated animals, they did not build up the immunity over generations. Settlers would move inland, finding better places to farm crops. And, by and large, the bay would turn into Sydney Cove, the origins of the first settlement. With farming becoming more successful inland, the British would promote free men and women to settle in New South Wales, and this would grow enough that by 1842 it would be recognized as a city. The growth would further increase due to a gold rush, and by the turn of the century it became the official state capital. Both world wars saw Australia's allegiance to the mother nation of Britain, which required it produce industrial capacity. After World War II, the nation would cast off its reputation as being a backwater by commissioning the Sydney Opera House to exemplify Australian high culture. On top of that, it began to transition away from the white-only immigration policy. This newfound multiculturalism during the 1970s would result in Sydney becoming one of the most diverse cities on the planet, including its western suburbs, well known for a large population of Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern migrants. Next on the list is Hobart, the second oldest city in Australia. This was founded in 1803. You can notice that there's a little bit of a lag between 1788, when Sydney was first settled. This was probably due to the lack of interest and the initial challenges in Botany Bay. Hobart, Tasmania is exemplary because it faced two significant challenges. One was the indigenous people, and the others were the convicts. The Tasmanian indigenous peoples were less technologically advanced than those of the rest of Australia due to intense isolation, and thereby they were far easier to subjugate. It didn't help the fact that many of these early colonists put bounties on their heads. For this incredibly dark reason, there are no full-blooded native Tasmanians. This also started out as a convict colony, and it would eventually be visited by Charles Darwin due his voyage of the Beagle. After a few decades, the importance of Tasmania as a penal colony would eventually decline, as whaling and sealing became more important. And this was kept alive by having fantastic natural harbors. Today, Hobart and the rest of Tasmania, by and large, are viewed as some sort of quirky, isolated part of the country that unfortunately never rose to the prominence of Sydney. Next on the list is Brisbane. Now, by this point, the British were fully aware of just how big this landmass was, and they wanted to set up a penal colony to the north. So they explored Moreton Bay, and eventually went up the Brisbane River. After all, they did want to have some fresh water, and they set up a convict settlement there. Unfortunately, fresh water also brings about a bunch of mosquitoes, which leads to a lot of diseases like malaria. On top of that, the Aboriginal groups would oftentimes attack settler farmland and burn down crops. There was also quite a lot of attention paid to the disproportionate number of Irish Catholics in these penal colonies. What a lot of people don't really know is that a considerable portion were also Jewish. Brisbane would eventually become the premier Jewish center in Australia. On top of that, there would be a budding Chinatown, as many Chinese immigrants were coming to work in the coal mines, gold mines, and railroads. Australia began to grow its reputation worldwide during the First World War, most notably under the Battle of Gallipoli, the first time Australians fought under their own flag. This growing recognition led to more migrants, coming primarily from Southern Europe. This broke a lot of the typical Anglo-Celtic trend that had been in place throughout much of Australian history up until this point. However, it wouldn't be until World War II when the city really shined, being the headquarters of much of the Allied command in the South Pacific region, under the American General MacArthur. Thankfully, Brisbane did not get attacked by the Japanese, in sharp contrast to Darwin. At the time, there was a genuine panic that Japan would engage in a full-scale invasion. The concern became so dire that many Australian politicians even considered seceding some of the lands north of Brisbane to the Japanese Empire. Thankfully, that did not happen. During the aftermath of the war, there was a rapid population boom, primarily due to immigration. And today, it is considered one of the most livable cities in the world, far, far away from its previous reputation as a mosquito-infested penal colony. Perth is next on the list. This city has a special place in my heart because I briefly lived there. It's the second most isolated city in the world. If you compare the distance between Perth and the next nearest city of over 1 million people, Adelaide, It is the second longest, only beaten out by Honolulu. The distance between Honolulu and San Francisco is longer than the distance between Perth and Adelaide, but with the one exception, Perth is the most isolated city. The British initially ignored Western Australia, but given the fear of French settlement in the area, they eventually colonized it. First, starting off in the Swan Colony. The Swan Colony was called the Swan Colony because it was set up on the Swan River, home to black swans. A permanent settlement was set up in 1829. However, it didn't really receive that much attention initially, and it wasn't until 2 decades later, when Eastern Australia halted convicts from entering their colonies, that Western Australia eventually became the destination for these infamous convicts, set up in Fremantle Prison, which you can see at the Fremantle Heritage District. Gold was eventually discovered in the interior, and that's when the city really started to kick off. In fact, Western Australia is pretty well known for its abundance in mineral wealth. While much of this is located outside of the city, Perth it was kind of pretty much seen and still is seen as the main port of entry for much of these resources to enter the outside world. As a result of this, the city holds on to its reputation as a glorified mining town, and given its reliance on the mining industry, it's oftentimes subject to boom and bust cycles due to the over reliance on commodity prices. Melbourne is the second largest city in Australia, dating back to the ancient era of 1835. The leading settler, John Batman, and yes, his name was literally John Batman, bought over 500,000 acres of land from the Aboriginals. However, to what degree this transaction was fair, given the language barrier and cultural barriers and the inability of Indigenous people to fully understand the concept of private ownership, is still hotly contested to this day. White settlers would take up patches of farmland in accordance to government decrees. However, there would also be a large number of squatters, many of whom were poor Irish Catholics, who lived in pretty terrible conditions. On top of that, there were also still a large number of Aboriginals located on the outskirts of these areas, subject to racial abuse, but still living in close contact with many of the white settlers for access to manufactured goods. The convict era was eventually replaced by, you guessed it, a gold rush era. And while it didn't last long, as most gold rushes do, it did kickstart enough capital to build a mint, stock exchange, and a variety of other major institutions, eventually making Melbourne one of the richest cities in the world. For a period of time, it was even larger than Sydney. It even built a very sophisticated cable tramway system, the foundation of one of the best light rail systems that still exists to this day. The city, also industrialized during both world wars, continued to acquire immense amounts of wealth and became a premier cultural capital of the country. The removal of the white-only immigration policy led many immigrants from East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East to flock to the suburbs of Melbourne, and it remains one of the world's great global cities. After Melbourne was founded, Adelaide was founded, but unfortunately it by and large gets ignored in the grand Australian scheme of things. One aspect of Adelaide that makes it unique from most other major Australian cities is that it never had any penal colonies. The founder, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, wanted his colony to be composed of free settlers, in sharp contrast to avoid much of the baggage seen in those previous settlements. As a result, Adelaide was known for having better civil rights and civil liberties, better freedom of the press, better freedom of religion, and treatment of minorities than many other parts of the country. It grew to the third largest city in the country, but eventually was passed by Brisbane and Perth. Darwin is next on the list. This is located in the Northern Territory. It was one of the first areas to be explored by Europeans, namely the Dutch. The first Brit to encounter the area was John Stokes, the captain of the HMS Beagle, the same ship that Darwin rode on. For this reason, the ship's captain decided to name the port after the brilliant scientist. However, its early history was very sleepy for a long period of time. This city has a tropical climate, in sharp contrast to much of the temperate and semi-tropical climates of the rest of Australia, which made it very difficult for European settlers at this time to really cultivate for farming. The city also went through a gold rush, but it was pretty small. What is quite amusing is that while the vast majority of this history is quite dull, there is one event that is quite possibly one of the most fascinating in Australia's history, and that is the bombing of Darwin during World War II. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese managed to take over large swaths of Southeast Asia and many Pacific island nations. This resulted in heavy fighting between Australians, who were part of the British Empire, and Imperial Japan. The Japanese managed to kick out the Australians at the Battle of Singapore and were held to a bitter stalemate in Papua New Guinea. Some Australian officials, as I mentioned before, were so terrified that they even considered letting Japan take over a considerable chunk of northern Australia. Thankfully, this did not happen, but the Japanese did manage to orchestrate two bombings of Darwin, with more explosive devices dropped on this city than on Pearl Harbor. This was the first and only time in Australia's history in which another nation attacked its own soil. Australian capital city. Yes, it is true, Sydney is not the capital, neither is Melbourne, it is Canberra, so stop saying it is Sydney because you'll piss off some Australians. Canberra is very young, even by Australian standards, founded in 1913. Both Sydney and Melbourne wanted to be the capital of the newfound Federation of Australia. However, in order to prevent one from gaining too much influence, Australians decided to create a new capital called Canberra, situated roughly in the middle. This city was not meant to be a major commercial, technological, or cultural powerhouse, but rather a quiet, planned city specifically for government institutions. The city's planning is not particularly organic, it's planned from the top down, based off of Garden City principles, and a design competition. This makes for a very impressive urban fabric, as can be seen from a satellite bird's eye view. However, it's not particularly conducive for walking. Nonetheless, it is the hub of nearly all the important federal institutions, such as the Parliament, High Court, the Australian National University, the Mint, the National Library, and of course all the foreign embassies. Since this is a government city, it has a reputation for a great deal of stability, since a large segment of its population is working in government federal jobs. And given the Australian government's reputation for stability, this means that the city, while not drastically growing at a rapid pace and not being the premier destination for partygoers, still remains the nervous system of the country. And there you have it, that is my overview of the origin and history of various Australian cities. In my next video, I'm going to be covering the origin and history of the cities of New Zealand. So stay tuned.